Portland, Oregon, August 15th, 2018. The pristine streets of Lake Oswego whispered wealth and success. Million-dollar homes stood like sentinels along manicured lawns, their windows reflecting the warm summer sunset. At 2167 Lakeshore Drive, the Anderson residence embodied everything the neighborhood represented: perfection, until the screams shattered it. At 9:17 p.m., a housekeeper's piercing cry cut through the evening calm. Through the open garage door, she had discovered Barbara Anderson's body sprawled on the concrete floor, blood pooling beneath her. Detective Nancy Miller arrived within minutes, her trained, eye-catching details that seemed too perfect, too carefully placed. "Something's not right here," Miller muttered, taking in the scene. "It's all too clean." She didn't know it then, but she was staring at the aftermath of a crime that would expose how three lives, tangled in ambition, desire, and betrayal, had created the perfect storm. The story of Barbara Anderson's death wasn't just about murder. It was about how the pursuit of perfection could drive someone to master the art of revenge. Let's go back to where it all began. If you're enjoying our content, quickly hit subscribe to join our community and never miss a moment. Let's dive in. Barbara and Richard Anderson were the couple others measured themselves against. Their life seemed scripted from a success story, each detail carefully curated to project an image of perfection. Barbara, at 32, had climbed the ranks at Nexus Pharmaceuticals with remarkable speed. Her ability to close million-dollar deals with major hospitals made her the company's top sales representative in the Pacific Northwest. She moved through Portland's elite social circles with effortless grace, her confidence drawing people into her orbit. Richard, 3 years her senior, commanded respect as a senior partner at Morton & Reed, one of Portland's most prestigious law firms. His specialty in corporate tax law might have seemed dull to outsiders, but his strategic mind and ruthless attention to detail had saved his clients millions. At work, he was known for his unwavering focus, a man who could spot a single misplaced decimal in a 1,000-page document. Their home in Lake Oswego was a testament to their shared drive for success. They hosted dinner parties where conversations about market trends and corporate mergers flowed as freely as expensive wine. From the outside, the Andersons had mastered the art of having it all. Then Stephen Anderson moved in. Richard's younger brother arrived in Portland with little more than a laptop and ambitious plans. At 30, Stephen had just watched his Seattle tech startup crash and burn, taking his investors millions with it. But where others saw failure, Stephen saw experience. He had his brother's sharp mind, but none of his rigidity. Where Richard calculated, Stephen charmed. "It's just temporary," Stephen had said when Richard offered him the guest house. 3 months tops, while I plan my next venture." Barbara found herself drawn to Stephen's presence. He listened when she talked about more than sales figures. He laughed at the small absurdities of their privileged world. Most dangerously, he saw beyond the perfect facade she had helped create. None of them realized then that Stephen's arrival had set something in motion. In the carefully ordered world of the Andersons, a single crack was about to split their foundation wide open. The line between friendship and something more blurred slowly, then all at once. At first, it was innocent. Barbara would find Stephen in the kitchen late at night, both of them seeking refuge from sleeplessness. She'd make tea, he'd share stories about his startup adventures, and they'd laugh about the absurdity of failure in a world obsessed with success. These midnight conversations became their ritual, a secret slice of authenticity in their polished lives. Richard's business trips grew more frequent as his law firm expanded to Seattle. Weekly client meetings meant 3-day absences, sometimes stretching to 5. In those quiet evenings, Barbara discovered a different kind of loneliness, not from being alone, but from realizing how rarely she missed her husband. October brought record rainfall to Portland. On a particularly stormy night, with Richard in New York closing a major corporate merger, Barbara found Stephen standing on the back patio, letting the rain soak through his clothes. She went out to call him in, umbrella in hand. Their eyes met, and the carefully constructed walls between them crumbled. The first kiss tasted of rain and rebellion. They knew they needed to be careful. Barbara purchased 2 prepaid phones from different convenience stores across town. They developed a code, simple text messages about coffee preferences that meant so much more. Black coffee today meant Richard was home. Craving a latte meant the coast was clear. The Riverfront Hotel became their sanctuary, always booked under different names, never the same room twice. Barbara would tell Richard she had client dinners. Stephen fabricated meetings with potential investors. They created a world of their own in those anonymous rooms, high above Portland's rainy streets, where they could pretend the rest of their lives didn't exist. But reality had a way of seeping in. Sometimes, in the early morning light, Barbara would catch a glimpse of her wedding ring on the hotel nightstand and feel the weight of her choices. Stephen would watch her dress for work, knowing she was returning to the life his brother had built for her. They were writing a story that could only end in disaster, but neither of them could stop turning the pages. In their secret moments together, they never talked about the future. The present was complicated enough, a delicate dance of stolen kisses, encrypted messages, and elaborate lies. Deep down, they both knew they were playing with fire in a house made of paper. By early 2016, their careful system of secret meetings and coded messages had evolved into something deeper, more dangerous. Stephen no longer saw their relationship as a passionate escape. He wanted more. "I can't keep pretending this is just an affair," Stephen told Barbara one evening in their usual suite at the Riverfront Hotel. "We could have a real life together." His venture capital work was taking off, giving him the confidence to envision a future beyond his brother's shadow. Barbara's response was always the same: silence followed by a change of subject. The thought of leaving Richard terrified her. Her position at Nexus Pharmaceuticals was intertwined with their social status, the power couple who dominated Portland's corporate circles. Richard's connections had helped her secure major hospital contracts. Walking away meant dismantling the life she'd spent years building. Summer 2016 brought their first close call. Richard came home early from a business trip, nearly catching them in the guest house. Barbara had barely made it to the kitchen, hands trembling as she poured coffee, while Stephen fumbled with excuses about needing her signature on rental agreement papers. Richard had looked between them, a flicker of something crossing his face before it disappeared behind his usual composed mask. The incidents multiplied. A client spotted them at a restaurant in Seattle, forcing Barbara to construct an elaborate story about a pharmaceutical conference. Stephen's assistant almost forwarded an intimate email to the wrong Anderson brother. Each near miss heightened their paranoia, but also intensified their connection. By 2017, the tension between the brothers became palpable. Family dinners turned into exercises in avoided glances and carefully chosen words. Stephen could barely look Richard in the eye, guilt mixing with resentment. Richard, ever the observer, noticed the change in his brother's behavior, but attributed it to Stephen's struggling business ventures. "You've changed," Richard told Stephen during a rare moment alone in his home office. "Ever since you moved to Portland, you're different." The irony of his words hung heavy in the air. He was right about the change, wrong about the cause. Barbara watched the brothers' relationship deteriorate, knowing she was the invisible fracture between them. During the day, she maintained her role as the perfect corporate wife. At night, she lay awake, Stephen's increasingly urgent pleas echoing in her mind. "We're living a lie. How long can this go on?" The answer came sooner than any of them expected. January 2018 brought subtle changes that Richard's analytical mind couldn't ignore. Barbara's phone was always face down now. She changed her passwords. Client dinners ran later than usual, and her explanations became increasingly detailed, as if rehearsed. At first, Richard dismissed his suspicions as paranoia, but 20 years of scrutinizing corporate tax documents had taught him those small discrepancies often hid larger deceptions. He began logging her behaviors in his phone: missed calls, late meetings, unexplained absences. The patterns emerged like red flags on a tax audit. By February, Richard had enough circumstantial evidence to justify the next step. Through his law firm's security contacts, he hired Marcus Jensen, an ex-FBI investigator known for his discretion. "I need certainty," Richard told Jensen in his downtown office, sliding across a manila envelope containing Barbara's schedules, photographs, and his documented observations. Jensen's surveillance operation was methodical: hidden cameras in the guest house, GPS trackers magnetically attached to both Barbara's and Stephen's vehicles. phone records obtained through Richard's corporate accounts. Every movement, every meeting, every message was documented with professional precision. On March 15th, Jensen delivered his report. Richard sat in his home office after hours, blinds drawn, reviewing hundreds of photographs. Barbara and Stephen entering the Riverfront Hotel, intimate dinners in Seattle, a kiss in the guest house driveway. Each image struck like a physical blow, yet Richard's face remained impassive as he organized the evidence into neat, chronological folders. What struck him most was their carelessness. They thought they were being careful with their burner phones and secret meetings, but to Richard's trained eye, their affair was like a poorly concealed tax scheme, obvious once you knew where to look. For 2 more weeks, Richard said nothing. He went through the motions of normal life, sharing meals with his wife and brother, all while gathering more evidence. He recorded their conversations, documented their lies about meetings and business dinners. Each deception was another exhibit in his mental case file. On April 1st, 2018, Richard finally confronted Barbara. He chose a Sunday evening when he knew Stephen would be in Seattle for a venture capital meeting. He laid out the evidence on their dining room table. Photographs, hotel receipts, phone records, with the same precision he used for client presentations. How long? The question cut through the room's silence. Barbara stood frozen, staring at the methodically arranged evidence of her betrayal. Her carefully constructed world of lies collapsed under the weight of Richard's documentation. "Richard, she began, but he raised his hand, silencing her. "I don't want explanations," he said, his voice carrying the same calm tone he used in corporate negotiations. "I want facts, times, dates, every detail." What Barbara didn't notice, as she tearfully confessed the timeline of her affair, was the cold calculation in Richard's eyes. She was so focused on the evidence before her that she missed the most crucial evidence of all, her husband's unnatural composure in the face of betrayal. After Barbara's confession that April evening, Richard maintained his routine with mechanical precision. He went to work, attended client meetings, and even joined social gatherings where Barbara's absence was explained away with a convenient business trip story. But behind his composed exterior, a different kind of calculation had begun. Late at night, in his downtown office where he knew there were no cameras, Richard started his research. His legal background had taught him how criminals got caught. Now he would learn how they didn't. His browser history filled with articles about unsolved murders, perfect crimes, and forensic evidence. Each search was made through anonymous browsers, each inquiry carefully deleted. By May 2018, his plan began taking shape. Richard created a detailed timeline of Stephen's movements, noting his predictable patterns: weekly investor meetings, favorite restaurants, regular gym sessions. He paid particular attention to Stephen's habit of leaving personal items around the house, a trait that had always irritated him but would now prove useful. Throughout June, Richard meticulously collected what he needed: a strand of Stephen's hair from the guest house shower drain, a set of fingerprints from a wine glass carefully lifted and preserved, blood from a bandage Stephen had carelessly left in the bathroom trash after cutting himself shaving. Each item was cataloged and stored in his office safe, alongside the surveillance photos from Jensen's investigation. July brought the technical preparations. Richard purchased 2 untraceable phones through a series of proxy buyers. He installed a new security system in their home, complete with cameras that could be selectively disabled. Each addition to his plan was justified to Barbara as extra security in light of recent neighborhood break-ins. The digital trail was next. Using his knowledge of corporate digital forensics, Richard began crafting a false narrative. He created email drafts on Stephen's laptop while his brother slept, planted suspicious searches in his browser history, and constructed a timeline that would suggest mounting tension between Stephen and Barbara. "Everything okay?" Barbara asked one evening in early August, finding Richard in his home office surrounded by work papers. "Just preparing for the Westbrook merger," he replied, his corporate mask firmly in place. The papers on his desk were indeed for the merger. But hidden beneath them was the final piece of his plan: a detailed schedule for August 15th, when everything would come together. What Barbara saw as her husband coping with betrayal through work, was actually Richard orchestrating her final day with the same attention to detail he gave his most complex tax cases. Every element was considered, every contingency planned for. He would transform his brother from charming venture capitalist to calculated killer in the eyes of the law. Richard had spent his career finding ways for the wealthy to escape consequences. Now he would ensure his brother faced the ultimate consequence for his betrayal. The perfect crime wasn't about not getting caught. It was about making sure someone else did. August 15, 2018, Richard's perfect plan unfolded with clockwork precision. 7 a.m., he left for work as usual, kissing Barbara goodbye. She had a full day of sales calls ahead, followed by what she thought was a late meeting with hospital administrators, a meeting Richard had fabricated in her calendar weeks ago. 6:45 p.m., Barbara returned home, exhausted from her day. Richard was in the kitchen preparing dinner, a new routine he'd started since discovering the affair in April, the perfect cover of a husband trying to repair his marriage. "You look tired," he said, pouring her a glass of Pinot Noir. "I got your favorite." The sedatives he'd ordered from the dark web months ago dissolved invisibly in the wine. 8:30 p.m., the drugs took effect. Barbara's speech slurred. Her movements became unsteady. Richard helped her toward the garage, claiming she needed fresh air. She stumbled, completely unaware of what was coming. 8:45 p.m., in the garage, with Barbara now unconscious beside her Tesla, Richard executed his plan. The security cameras were disabled, a scheduled malfunction. He pulled the knife he'd taken from the guest house kitchen earlier that day, the same knife Stephen used regularly. With calculated precision, he plunged it into Barbara's chest multiple times, ensuring the angle suggested a crime of passion. At 9 p.m., Richard meticulously arranged the scene. Stephen's business card, stolen from his wallet weeks ago, was dropped near the body. He planted the DNA evidence he'd collected: hair from Stephen's shower drain, traces of blood from a discarded bandage. He scattered items to suggest a struggle, but not too messy. Everything had to look real, but clear enough for police to find. At 9:10 p.m., in the basement, Richard changed clothes and submerged his bloody garments in a prepared acid solution, a technique learned from his late-night research. Back in the garage, he made final adjustments to the crime scene. 9:15 p.m., he called Stephen, who was at a business dinner in Seattle, an alibi Richard had orchestrated by connecting him with investors. The call would establish Richard's ignorance and later make Stephen appear suspicious. 9:17 p.m., right on schedule, the housekeeper arrived for her evening cleaning. Her schedule changed by Richard weeks ago from mornings to nights. Her piercing scream echoed through the quiet neighborhood as she discovered Barbara's body through the open garage door. Police arrived within minutes. Detective Nancy Miller surveyed the scene. Barbara's body sprawled beside her Tesla, the knife nearby, blood spatter telling a story of rage and passion. Everything pointed to Stephen Anderson, the scorned lover. Richard played his part perfectly, the devastated husband maintaining just enough composure to answer questions. But as Miller studied the scene, something felt off. The evidence was too neat, too perfectly placed, like someone had orchestrated a scene rather than committed a crime of passion. August 16, 2018. Detective Nancy Miller stood before the evidence board, studying the photos from the Anderson murder. The case seemed straightforward. Barbara Anderson, found dead in her garage, multiple stab wounds, evidence pointing clearly to Stephen Anderson. Too clearly. "Bring him in," she ordered, watching Stephen's arrest through the precinct window. He'd been picked up from his Seattle hotel at dawn, still wearing his business suit from the previous night's dinner meeting. The interrogation room was cold, deliberate. Stephen sat there, shell-shocked, as Detective Miller laid out the evidence: his business card at the crime scene, traces of his blood, his fingerprints on the knife. "I was in Seattle," Stephen kept repeating, his voice cracking. "Ask Richard. He set up the investor meeting himself." Miller watched him break down when she showed him Barbara's photos. His raw emotion seemed genuine, different from the controlled grief she'd seen in Richard the night before. Something nagged at Miller. She returned to the Anderson house surveillance footage. The system had malfunctioned between 8:30 p.m. and 9:15 p.m., exactly when the murder occurred. "When was the last system maintenance?" she asked the security company. "July 30th, they replied. Mr. Anderson scheduled it himself. Miller's team dug deeper. They discovered Richard had accessed the security settings remotely. Not suspicious on its own, it was his house. But why hadn't he mentioned this? The breakthrough came from cybercrimes. An analyst flagged unusual activity on Richard's office computer. Beneath layers of deleted searches, they found his dark web history. Discussions about untraceable sedatives, forensic evidence handling, security camera loops. Check his credit cards, Miller ordered. The team uncovered a pattern. Small purchases at random convenience stores across Portland, each one buying burner phones, the same type found in Barbara's car. The surveillance footage from Richard's law firm revealed more. On nights he claimed to be working late, cameras showed him leaving through the back exit, returning hours later. The timestamps matched perfectly with Barbara's estimated time of death. He created the perfect alibi, Miller realized. Everything Stephen supposedly did, Richard actually did himself. The final piece came from Richard's private investigator, Marcus Jensen. He came forward with the full surveillance report, including photos Richard had never submitted to police. They showed Barbara and Stephen together, yes, but also revealed Richard following them, watching, planning. August 27, 2018. While processing Barbara's personal effects, Detective Miller's team discovered a leather-bound journal hidden in a false bottom of her jewelry box. Unlike the meticulously crafted digital evidence Richard had planted, this was raw, real, and damning. "I know what Richard is capable of," Barbara had written 3 weeks before her death. "The way he looks at me now, it's different. Clinical. Like I'm one of his tax cases he needs to solve. He's planning something. I can feel it." The diary entries became increasingly urgent. August 1st, found medication receipts in Richard's coat. When I searched online, they were sedatives. He never mentioned having trouble sleeping. August 10th, he's being too nice, making dinner, asking about my schedule. The last time he was this interested in my daily routine was when he hired that investigator. Miller knew these weren't the writings of someone planning to run away with a lover. They were the worried observations of a woman who feared her husband. The technical evidence team made another breakthrough. While Richard had carefully managed the security camera footage, he'd overlooked something crucial: cell tower pings from his personal and burner phones. "Look at this," tech analyst James Cooper showed Miller. Richard's phone pinged these towers in sequence on the night of the murder. The data painted a clear picture. Richard's phone had moved from his office to the Riverfront Hotel, where he'd collected items from Barbara and Stephen's regular meeting spot, then back to Lake Oswego. His careful alibi of working late crumbled under the weight of digital evidence he couldn't control. Most damning was the burner phone data. Richard had used Barbara's supposedly secret phone after her death, sending messages to Stephen's burner phone to create evidence of an argument. But he didn't realize that even burner phones created records of which towers they pinged. He was too perfect in every other way, Miller noted. He forgot technology leaves traces we can't always see. Miller laid out all the evidence in her final case report. Barbara's diary revealing her growing fear, cell tower data destroying Richard's alibi, the burner phone activity after Barbara's death, security system tampering, dark web purchases, the planted evidence at the crime scene. Each piece now told a different story than the one Richard had tried to create. It wasn't about a scorned lover's violent crime of passion. It was about a controlling man's methodically planned revenge, executed with the same precision he brought to his corporate tax work. The case was ready. Tomorrow they would arrest Richard Anderson. September 1st, 2018. The arrest of Richard Anderson made headlines across Portland. Police detained him at Morton and Reed during a board meeting, a calculated decision by Detective Miller to publicly dismantle the image he'd worked so hard to maintain. Richard's facade finally cracked. The composed tax attorney who had planned everything so meticulously began to unravel. "I did everything right," he kept muttering as they led him away in handcuffs. Every detail was perfect. The trial, January 2019. The Portland courthouse had never seen a case quite like this. The prosecution presented their evidence methodically, mirroring the precise nature of Richard's crime. Barbara's diary entries echoed through the courtroom, her voice from beyond the grave painting a picture of growing terror beneath a perfect surface. Stephen's testimony proved devastating. He spoke of the affair without excuses, his voice breaking as he described his last conversation with Barbara. She was going to end it, he revealed. She said she couldn't live with the lies anymore. That was 2 days before. He couldn't finish the sentence. Richard sat emotionless throughout the trial, except for one moment, when the cell tower data was presented, his carefully constructed alibi destroyed by technology he couldn't control. For the first time, the jury saw a flash of the rage that had driven him to murder. The jury took just 6 hours to reach their decision. Richard Anderson was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. The perfect life you tried to protect, Judge Marshall stated during sentencing, became the perfect evidence of your guilt. The Anderson family would never be the same. Stephen left Portland unable to bear the weight of the memories. He declined interviews and avoided the spotlight, choosing instead to rebuild his life quietly in Chicago. The case became required study at Portland Police Academy, a testament to both meticulous planning and the small details that break even the most carefully constructed crimes. Detective Miller would later say it wasn't Richard's intelligence that betrayed him, but his obsession with perfection. Morton and Reed renamed their tax division and donated substantial sums to domestic violence prevention. Barbara's diary was used with the family's permission to help train officers in recognizing signs of psychological control and manipulation. In prison, Richard maintained his rigid routines, organizing his cell with the same precision he once applied to tax laws. His fellow inmates said he spent hours writing in notebooks, perhaps still trying to perfect a plan that had already failed. The house on Lakeshore Drive sold quickly, but locals said no one stayed long. Maybe it was just coincidence, or maybe the weight of what happened there was too heavy to bear. Detective Miller kept a photo on her desk, not of the crime scene or the evidence, but of Barbara's last diary entry. Perhaps the most dangerous thing about perfection is how it hides what's broken inside. It served as a reminder that behind every perfect facade, there might be a story waiting to shatter.